Welcome, everybody. I would like to thank you so much for joining us today for this really important conversation with the authors of the report, the Open Licensing Models in the Cultural Heritage Sector. I'm Dee Harris. I'm the Director of Open Culture Storytelling with Creative Commons, and I'm delighted to open today's session. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Bridget Vizina, and she's going to kick this webinar off.
Thank you so much, Dee, and hello, everyone. It's really a great honor for me to welcome you all to this Open Culture Live webinar. So as you mentioned, my name is Bridget Vizina, and I'm the Director of Policy and Open Culture at Creative Commons. And I'm really pleased to be hosting this conversation on the economics of open. And I'm here with the authors of a brand new study that was led by CREATE, which is the Center for Regulation of the Creative Economy at the University of Glasgow. And it was prepared in collaboration with Creative Commons. And the title of the study is Open Licensing Models in the Cultural Heritage Sector. And the authors of this study are here with us to present it to you and to have a conversation. So I just wanted to say that this issue has been really dear to me for the past years because we collaborated very closely with Bart and with Chris to really try to find out what are the real world economic dimensions of open licensing heritage collections by cultural heritage institutions like museums, libraries, archives, and galleries. And they did so over many jurisdictions, the UK, the EU, the US, and Brazil. And I feel like this study is really timely because many institutions, many cultural heritage institutions are often ready to open up their collections, but they still have questions about how to finance it all and how to do it sustainably. So these are the questions that the study aims to tackle. And also, I want to mention that we published a barriers report a few years ago, and it's linked also in the agenda. So if you want to read more about what stands in the way of cultural heritage institutions going open, you can find more information in there. But one of the obstacles that was mentioned over and over again was money. So not only the costs associated with like digitizing a collection, maintaining an online presence, but also the fear of loss of revenue, whether that fear is real or perceived, when moving from a paying licensing scheme to an open one. And we've also heard studies that show that there's little profit to be made with paying licensing systems, given the high costs involved. But I really concretely wanted to understand, how does it all work in practice? How do archives, museums, libraries, and galleries of different sizes, operating in different legal contexts, and given the financial realities of our world today, how do they all do it, and how do they manage to still remain financially sustainable while making their collections freely and openly accessible? So I'm really excited that you're all here to join this conversation, and I'd like to briefly introduce our panelists. Their full bios are in the agenda if you want to know more about them. But here they are. We have with us Bartolomeo Miletti from CREATE University of Glasgow, Christopher Erickson, also from CREATE, Alini Iramina, also from CREATE, and Victoria Stobo, who's from the Center for Archive Studies at the University of Liverpool. And to kick us off, I'd like to hand it over to you, Chris. If you could walk us through what were your key findings in the study. So, Chris, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brigitte. I'm really excited to be here and to share this more than a year-long work with everybody. So my role on the project has been to support the research design and also to help contextualize the findings which Bartolomeo, Victoria, and Aline are going to share. Contextualize those findings in relation to a body of literature from business models, management studies, and innovation studies, which have been considering, open in sort of the commercial world. So I think our study is somewhat novel in the sense that we're using this business model concept in the context of GLAM. With a few exceptions, this is one of the first studies that's trying to accomplish that. We're not trying to suggest that GLAMs should run themselves as a business, but we think that there are insights in that literature that could be applied in practical ways to help sustain GLAM activities. So I just want to say a couple words to kick off about the research design, sort of the nerdy methods side of things. Um, as Brigitte said, we cover 4 jurisdictions, and our approach is a multiple non-embedded case study, which basically just means that we've taken the standalone institutions as the object of interest, and we're trying to understand their institutional context and the process that they've gone through, in some cases adopting an open orientation in sharing their, excuse me, there's a mosquito, in sharing their archival or heritage materials. So with case study, typically you want to go for coverage of the broadest amount of possible cases or instances. And we've done that across jurisdictions, but also in terms of type, covering galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, noting that there's some blurriness in those definitions because sometimes institutions, straddle multiple different functions. But by and large, we've tried 16 total institutions. Most of them are large or medium size. We're missing a whole array of smaller type institutions. So that's something to perhaps consider for the future. I think just to pick on one of the advantages of this research method is that it gives us understanding of change, adaptation, response within organizations. It's a great way to study those kinds of questions. So what did you do when confronted with this challenge? How did your organization respond? And to get that direct answer from the respondent, gives us something close to real world validity, perhaps more than something like a survey method could have accomplished. So that's the research design. Just moving on. So there's a huge body of really fascinating literature, going back to the early 90s about how firms and companies were using open business models in their work. And oftentimes this was, characterized as like a response to a negative external stimulus, right? Like, oh, you no longer control the intellectual property because the internet has arrived, and if it's kind of copying is now available. So how are businesses going to respond to that forced openness, right? But then there were also studies which highlighted that there could be some sort of, at that time, bizarre, extremophile organizations that somehow managed to open up all of their IP, but still, turn a profit and be able to sustain their activities. And so a lot of research was spent on, well, how does that happen? And some of the most important ways that it was observed to happen is, for example, through complementarity. This is where a firm controls something on one side, and then they give something else away for free that benefits the other product, service, or innovation that they also control. So it's sort of a strategic kind of openness. Also, firms are observed to join into open communities like open source software as a way to help shape those evolving communities and offerings to serve some sort of internal challenge that they face. So by having a seat at the table, they were able to benefit from the free and open, software, even if other firms could sort of also benefit from that. It helps sometimes firms get to market fast because they just can borrow something which is open in the public domain and use that instead of use something proprietary. And they found it useful to engage with communities and build partnerships and relationships with, for example, open source software developers and with other groups. And so it sort of could sometimes also straddle their marketing function. Now, there's still challenges, and those relate to things like the ever-present potential for competition from free riders who just are able to compete by offering the thing on the market for a lower price. There's also potential for lack of legal clarity. So and this is something that I think Victoria Bart and Aline will talk about. If the licensing parameters for the open contribution are not ironclad, then an emergent rights holder or some sort of forking could happen in the future, which then throws the whole product or collective endeavor into doubt. And so having that sort of legal clarity in terms of the open contribution is incredibly important to sustaining these activities. And finally, revenue is the number one concern, right? How do you generate, why would somebody pay for something which is open? That's a constant challenge for firms who do this. So moving ahead. So finally, for me, this is an exciting diagram which you can find on, I think it's page 19 of the published report. this is just a schematic which shows lots of different ways that a firm or an organization can relate to open communities. So looking at the top of the screen, um, a firm could take in something which is open from an existing sort of open user community, say, hey, oh, this is cool, I'll borrow that, I'll take that because it's licensed under an open license, and use it to create something new. And then they might also, though, release a product out at the bottom end of the diagram called free revealing. They might release that out into the open world and let open communities and users do whatever they want with it, right? What I've observed in my research is that sometimes the openness at the top actually also helps the openness at the bottom. And that's because if there's no sort of like big corporate rights holder like Disney who sort of controls the upstream, IP, then that means that those downstream users are free to sort of adapt, use, and change the stuff as they wish. And so that actually creates this sort of virtuous circle of innovation, which we're trying to show in this diagram. And so we wonder, and as Bart and Eliane and Victoria will share with you just now, we wonder where in this sort of relationship the GLAM institutions might find themselves. Can they be in the center of this, for example? So with that, I will hand it over to my colleagues.
Well, thank you, Dee and Bridget, for organizing this webinar. I know we don't have much time, so picking up from what Chris was saying, I was responsible for liaising with and interviewing the Brazilian institutions. And I think it would be nice, so in this webinar, to share a few insights we gathered from those conversations. If you had the opportunity to read the report, one of the themes that emerged in our study was the savings that cultural heritage institutions experience when they shift from closed policies to open policies. So in the case of the Brazilian institutions, we saw that those who moved to clear open policies, they have reported some benefits. So the two examples we have in our case studies are the Pinacoteca of São Paulo and the Historical and Institutional Archive of the Museum of the Republic. Both institutions previously, they operated another, let's say, what we could call a closed models, as they charged fees for the commercial use of digitized versions of their collections. But they changed that. Pinacoteca changed that in 2017, and the Museum of the Republic changed that in 2022. But what is interesting when we read our study, what we found out was that in both cases, they highlighted cost savings when moving to open models, especially in terms of time and human resources that they used to spend in managing these requests. So in the case of the Museum of the Republic, they mentioned that, especially because they are a federal and public museum, they had a whole internal bureaucracy to manage all those requests. And they had like 1 or 2 civil servants that were working on that. But then in 2022, when they were already part of the Brazilian Institution of Museums, we call IBRAM in Brazil, they adopt a new resolution that applied to all its museums, because this institution in Brazil, they are responsible for managing more than 30 museums in Brazil. And they start using this the Creative Commons license. And then, for example, the Museum of the Republic, they start also making all their digitized images of their works in public domain available for free. And one of the things that when we were talking to them, what they said was they thought that this was great because it made their lives much, much easier. And they didn't have to put so much effort anymore because it didn't compensate financially and even in terms of time. However, what is interesting as well is because they said, even though it was great for most of these museums, they're also the part of training. So it's another of our teams that we address, that even though you adopt open license and then it's a good thing, they consider it's beneficial for them. They also said that they need to have some kind of training. So there are also costs involved when it comes to adopting open license. And in case of Brazil, also, even though if you see talking with all those institutions, they have this preference for open models. Well, we saw that they face a lot of challenges and common challenges when it comes not only with licensing, but also when digitizing their collections. One of them, as I mentioned, was staff shortage. Most of them have like very small teams to work with digitalization and also with license, different from European, US, and British institutions. They don't have an IP team or a copyright team, so they have to work with their legal teams who works with all other issues and not only with licensing and copyright. They have technical infrastructure limitations as well. They not only struggle with the lack of financial resources, but also in terms like they don't have adequate equipment. They have other, in terms of storage capacity, both Pinacoteca and the National Library mentioned that they have a lot of concerns about that. The Museum of São Paulo, the National Museum of São Paulo, they also mentioned they struggle with that, and they also have some other issues in terms of interoperability of their database with their website. So they have many concerns. And in legal uncertainties, I think all of them, but it's interesting when it comes to both the Museum of the Republic and Pinacoteca, they said that when they adopt a copyright policy, things became much more clear. So this is something to consider. But I guess overall, this is it about my side. I don't know. I think it's Victoria now.
Thanks very much, Aline. Just following on from Aline's points there, looking at the Brazilian institutions, I'm going to speak briefly about the case study interviews and some of the responsive results that we saw from institutions in Europe, the UK and the USA. So I've decided to focus on one of the themes that we identified in the research was engaging with platforms and communities. So I thought I would talk a little bit about platforms and the different kind of challenges and opportunities associated with those. So across the different institutions, we saw platforms used, including Wikimedia, Flickr, Polona, Academica, Google Arts and Culture. We already know that there are significant benefits to engaging with platforms outside of our own institutional portals, and probably the most obvious example and consistent example in the research so far has been Wikimedia. So our case study with the National Library of Wales demonstrates the benefits of supported engagement with a platform like Wikimedia through the Wikimedian in Residence programme. I also wanted to mention the National Library of Poland's work in this area. So Polona and Academica are platforms that they've developed that make innovative use of the extended, of the dedicated terminals exception in European copyright law. And that allows them to make both open access public domain works available throughout Poland, and internationally, but also in copyright works within Poland as well. Some of the challenges and opportunities associated with working with platforms and engaging with communities in particular go back to, I guess, the kind of the bread and butter tasks of cultural heritage institutions. So documenting our collections. So in addition to the kind of the financial hurdles and some of the, I guess, kind of practical hurdles that Aline was mentioning in relation to Brazilian cultural heritage institutions. We know that many cultural heritage organisations have significant backlogs related to their collections. So one of the themes that came through in the interviews was this process of documenting collections, different collections, whether the institution in question collects library collections, archive collections, museum collections. Often organisations will hold lots of different kinds of material that needs to be described and documented in different ways. And one of the things that struck me is we're already doing a lot of this work. Our current collection practices are improving when it comes to documenting new accessions, working with communities, developing more equitable and respectful relationships. And we're getting rights issues nailed down relatively early in this process, but we still have a lot of legacy collections where that isn't the case. So for example, previous digitisation projects where material has been uploaded to Wikimedia or to Flickr with different licensing terms, different flavours of CC licenses, whereas now we can see those institutions that have made the move to open using public domain mark and CC0 instead. So there are these kind of challenges associated with how we go back and kind of retro-convert some of that data that's been made available. Wrangling the data between different platforms, but also communicating those different rights issues and licensing terms across multiple collections. So whether we're indicating that material is in the public domain, that it's CC0, it's openly available for reuse, but alongside that, still communicating where material is still in copyright, where the access terms are different, for example. In some of our European institutions, the Dutch National Archives, for example, uses an extended collective licensing process for some of its photographic collections. So distinguishing between those different regimes, essentially, and how it affects access and reuse. And then I think emphasizing all of the work that goes into that document, all of the work going into that documentation process. If we're already doing a lot of this work, it doesn't really make sense to then add more administrative processes on top of this for not much financial return. So if we're thinking about that licensing process in the past, or institutions may still be trying to generate some revenue from licensing that public domain material, it's really just adding more administrative processes to work that we're already doing. One theme that came through, particularly talking to the Indianapolis Museum of Art in Newfields, is the kind of wrangling that's happening on the back end relating to the content management systems that we're using. So the kind of copyright literacy and experience needed to determine when works are in the public domain, to identify rights holders and works that are still in copyright. How do we record all of this information? How do we make it available, not just to users, but within the institution itself, so that when work enters the public domain, we're ensuring that our online collections are updated and reflecting that as well. And then finally, another challenge, potential opportunity going into the future, and a theme that did start to come into the interviews was the challenges associated with artificial intelligence. We know from a recent report by Andrea Wallace and Michael Weinberg that there's been an increase in bot traffic on cultural institutions' websites. We know that data is being scraped and being used for the models being developed by these companies, and maybe starting to think about how that's going to affect the digital infrastructure that we're reliant upon within the cultural heritage sector. So that's a kind of whistle-stop tour of some of the themes that I noticed coming through across multiple different case studies. And I think I am handing over to Bart, who has the recommendations coming out of the report.
Yeah, thanks very much, Victoria, and hi, everyone. So yeah, during this last part of the presentation, I'm going to briefly summarize the 5 key recommendations that we developed based on the findings of the study. And firstly, let me acknowledge that, boiling all these findings down to 5 recommendations wasn't easy. And it wasn't easy also because of the diversity of the cultural heritage sectors, really, because I think that's a challenge that any research project in this area faces. You can't just look at what big institutions do in highly touristic areas and replicate that at smaller scale. So that's, that was something we were conscious and mindful when we drafted these 5 recommendations. And we drafted them in a way that they're targeted primarily at cultural heritage institutions, but we hope they're helpful also for policymakers and funders, because really all parties need to be, work together in these areas. And so the 5 recommendations are: first, to assess the costs of managing closed licensing models. So that's something you've heard already from Alini and Victoria, and that previous studies had also found that basically administering licensing comes with costs, and those costs are usually higher than the income you generate through image licensing. And our study confirmed that finding also in Brazil and across the 4 jurisdictions. And most of the institutions we spoke with saw decrease in cost. Some even saw an increase in revenue by switching to open licensing models, and that thanks to new photography services which are more responsive to user needs and therefore perceived as better value for money than paying for maybe a lower resolution version of an existing photograph of an artifact. So that's the first one. The second one is to explore interaction with users, but as well as with local communities around open collections. So that builds upon one of the key learnings from the business model literature that Chris mentioned earlier, and that is that openness basically offers opportunities for collaboration and collaborative production that simply don't exist if the resources are closed. So explore collaboration, and not just online with users, but also with local communities, very important from the outset, also to devise open policies that respect cultural sensitivities and other values. And by doing that, you build a relationship that is important. Also, it can have economic returns later as well. The third recommendation is something that I believe Victoria briefly touched upon, which is to track follow-on creative uses. So that's another theme that emerged from our interviews. And actually what emerged is that most cultural heritage institutions do not track how their collections are being used. And sometimes for good reasons. I mean, the obvious one is lack of capacity to do so. Or privacy concerns, or or also to offer like an experience of reuse that is frictionless. But also a few of the cultural heritage institutions we spoke with do track and report benefits of doing so. And so they demonstrate that tracking follow-on uses in a way that is non-intrusive and beneficial is possible and desirable. And you can do things like simply keep monitoring web analytics, and that can already produce very powerful and impressive figures on platforms like Wikimedia Commons, for example, that then lead to indirect benefits, like if you demonstrate the impact and outreach, and basically it helps you demonstrate that you're achieving your public mission as a cultural heritage institution. And there are other ways as well. You can also encourage creative users to then share what they create with you, or to share them via a platform or competitions and so on. The fourth one is about co-developing best practices in sharing and curating. And so that comes from a cost we identified in open licensing, which is the cost of preparing collections for upload, but also then there is a cost sometimes in negotiating social norms with open platforms. And so basically sometimes the cultural heritage institutions may have curatorial practices and norms that may clash with the open norms of the platforms like Wikimedia Commons, for example. So a concrete example is like how much information to include in a caption accompanying an image, or whether, which information goes into the caption, which goes into the metadata, and so on. But again, we believe that is basically an opportunity to co-develop best practices and learn from each other. And the last one is really to devise activities that have a local focus and global outreach. So that really speaks to the complementarity that also Chris mentioned earlier. So basically you can attract customers to your place, and also speaks to the challenge I mentioned at the very beginning in a way, because like how do you find commonalities across institutions that operate in such diverse sectors? Well, all of them have space usually, which is in a place with local communities. So really, and you can create opportunities for value generation and capture at the local level, also by reaching out to global communities through open licensing. So again, that's really the very short version of our recommendation. They are explained in much more detail in the report, so I would encourage you to go and read that. Thank you.
Thank you, Bart. Would you just elaborate a little bit more about if there were any tensions that you realized in the practice during this study?
Yes, definitely. I mean, there are tensions. I think the obvious one, which is exists at both in any policy and debate around culture and but which also is reflected, I think, in the business model literature we examine, is the one between control versus free access. And that's it's not just a theoretical tension, but is a very real one that exists at a regulation and policy level, but also in the relationship between cultural heritage institutions and their publics or other stakeholders, and sometimes even within the cultural heritage institutions itself. There can be that tension, like different departments, different people having different views on what's best. So in a way, that's what our study examined and found that from an open licensing point of view, there are a lot of benefits that we just outlined of opening up digital collections. And then, yeah, there are other tensions as well. I think I briefly mentioned some of them. The one between the local dimension of a cultural heritage institutions and the global dimension of open licensing and online technologies, as well as the one between curatorial norms and open norms, which again, just to reiterate, I think those are really, potentially positive tensions that can lead to constructive debates and the co-development of best practices. Yeah.
Thank you. And, Alini, I'd love to ask you, what surprised you about the study itself? Did anything just pop out as, oh, I'm shocked?
Well, first, as someone because I think I'm the one who doesn't have so much experience working with cultural heritage institutions in the group. So I was quite impressed by the work that all these institutions are developing, particularly in Brazil with the lack of sources. But I think one of our conclusions, and I will link with one of the conclusions of our studies, say that, for example, how we can see that some cultural heritage institutions' appetite for legal risk appears to be more closely linked to their financial resources and institutional standing than to differences in copyright law. And I think that's very interesting when it comes to Brazilian legislation, because different from, for example, the US, where you have like the fair use clause, and the UK and the EU, that you have specific limitation and exceptions for cultural heritage institutions for preservation, everything. In Brazil, we don't have that. It's like our list of limitations, exceptions are very small, like we don't have many, and we don't have any specific for cultural heritage institutions. And when I was talking with some of them, one of my questions, because most of them didn't raise legal concerns. They had like some legal issues when it comes to orphan works, some of them with like some backlog when it comes to licensing. So they were trying to get license from other works that they had previously, but they were not so concerned about the fact that the law don't benefit them. And then one of the things I realized and I was surprised about was that they have interpreted the law quite open, especially because of a recent decision from the Superior Court of Justice. So they are more open to take risks. Of course, in some cases they're conservative, but I think they have so many other challenges when it comes to digitizing their collections, that when it comes to all these resources, everything, that in terms of the law itself, as someone that worked with copyright policy and as a legal scholar, a legal researcher, I thought it was quite interesting. It surprised me that they said, oh, it would be great if we had a clear legal framework specifying that we have limitations, exceptions, but that's not our biggest concern. If we have a clear copyright policy that address that, it would be enough. And also we have a lot of internal work to do before actually so our main concern is not a reform of the law, but we have other issues to take into account. I guess that was my biggest surprise, at least from my own experience.
Thank you so much. So, Chris, I'd really love to hear more about what you feel the real economic trade-offs are here, the value proposition of open models. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah. The interesting thing to me actually about this is how are the non-economic constraints and incentives that exist in the GLAM sector, which are sort of parallel and in some ways different to what you see in private firms. One tension is around control, right? It seems as though for GLAM institutions, there's a desire to maintain control, and it's not only because of, this thing has inherent value, like I could license it, but also because there might be concerns on the part of the donors of the item or the community that's associated with the cultural practice, or so there are questions about like what's going to happen to this thing when it goes out into the wild. Is it going to be treated with respect? And I think one of the interesting things that came out, and this is also confirmed in an earlier white paper, Europeana white paper by Verweyen and colleagues, is that there is a benefit to openness that helps in a sense with the control issue, in that if your open version is the best and the most authoritative version, as Victoria would say, if it's like the real record of the item on the internet, and as we know, the internet is fraught with all kinds of uncertainty and messy and lower quality versions of the thing. If you can have the best authoritative version, then that's a kind of it almost transcends economic benefit, because then you're actually providing real value to the world, and in return you're fulfilling your public mission as being the shepherd of an important piece of cultural heritage. So it's a really tricky tension, and I think that comes through quite a bit with our investigation. But I think that's what makes it so interesting, that museums and galleries are different from firms.
There were 16, obviously, cultural heritage institutions that were part of the study, and we have 4 of them here today. They're just going to speak a little bit about their experience, what's working, what's not working, and just a reflection. So I'd like to first invite Christy Henshaw from the Wellcome Collection about your involvement in the study. Christy?
Well, thank you so much for, first of all, for letting me represent Wellcome Collection in the study. That was great, and always really, really happy to share our experiences and sort of our, I guess, perspective on things. I just want to say, I know that we do have a unique, not a unique perspective, but we have a specific perspective. No, I just wanted to acknowledge that we do come from a position of privilege here at Wellcome Collection, that we are self-funded. We don't rely on public funding. We don't rely on donations. We have operationalized our digitization activities to a large extent. So we are not necessarily dependent on income to carry out our digitization activities. So I am coming at it from that perspective. But saying that, I think like any other organization, cultural heritage organization, who are shepherding and custodians of historic materials, especially global historic materials like we are, we need to think about like what is our role. And our role is to provide safe storage for these items, but also to provide access to these items. And digitization is just as much providing access as letting people come and visit us in person and, fill out a form to call something up from the stacks and look at it physically. Why should we be charging them to view the thing online? We're not charging them to come and visit and look at the thing. It's all kind of part of what we see as the basic sort of service that we want to offer people. So open access for us was a process. We weren't fully open all the time. It's relatively recent, I'd say, since 2015 that we were fully open, and using open licenses to the fullest extent that we can. But yeah, it's part of our mission to provide the access, and open licensing is basically what and the use of the public domain mark is what sort of enables that.
Great, thank you so much. Molly, we'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
Sure. Hi, good morning. And I'm coming to you from an audio booth. So excuse the fog. It's the light above me and I can't adjust it, but I am here. I just wanted to share that this study happened at a time where we have a lot going on in DC. And I really feel that a hallmark of this study was sharing our work and cultural exchange. And that's meant a lot to me. And I really appreciated connecting at that point. And just wanted to start off by saying that. So the benefits of participating in the project for us, we're seeing what other institutions are doing with their collections and Wikipedia. and considering the possibilities. The findings supported furthering our involvement in our work, and the openness that helps institutions achieve their public mission was very important. There's a potential for a global audience that the findings showed, and that also was reiterated why we do our work. The GLAM professionals also saw open licensing as a way to reach communities beyond the walls of their institutions. Again, that touches on our goals in our work. The opportunity for building relationships with other organizations, as I mentioned, and the fact that platforms could help increase the visibility of collections, making them available to new audiences. And overall, the findings align with our vision, mission, and values to provide access and inclusion, to deepen our public understanding, curiosity, and continuous learning, and to be a resource for the nation. And some of the challenges we face occur with the restrictions that can pop up with foundations and estates that hold the rights to modern and contemporary art, the time and staff to upload the images and add the metadata, the scraping of images and metadata for commercial usage, which can occur, and learning the norms and standards of the new community takes time, practice, and patience. That's been a big hurdle. So thank you for providing such a thorough examination and report.
Molly, thank you so much for that. Even from the fog, it was very clear. I'd like to now invite Jason Evans from the National Library of Wales to speak.
Great. Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I'd also like to just say, thank you so much for this report. I think it's going to be really useful. I can see from our perspective already how its findings will be of real benefit to us. So one of the things that the report highlighted was that open can bring reputational gains and awareness of our collections and what it is that our institution is all about. And I think that's something that we've certainly seen in our process of going open in Wales. And I think that in the same way, this report is going to help raise awareness, and being part of this report is going to help raise awareness of the National Library of Wales and the work that we're doing to try and remove barriers to access. And I also think the report's going to be a brilliant advocacy tool internally, and I can see it being very useful to a lot of other organizations as well. I think being able to see our situation in the global context with so many solid examples of the benefits of open licensing, that's really going to help us drive the conversation forward. In terms of our ongoing challenges, I think in terms of policy, we have quite a robust policy now, especially around public domain works. And we've even had some success recently with licensing, openly licensing collections that are in copyright, but where we hold the copyright, following a discussion around value and impact and how this aligns with our mission. So I feel like we're doing well there. I think the biggest challenges remaining for us are more logistical and technical. So how do we transition from that licensing system where we're raising fees for copies? How do we make that transition to something fully open? And also technically, how do we implement downloadable content in a way where we can try at least to capture some of the metrics? Because I think for our funders and for senior management, it's important to fill that void of licensing income with some kind of framework for demonstrating the value and impact that open brings. And in an ideal world, that would mean being able to capture some of the interaction with our content on third-party platforms, social media. So there's challenges around that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. And Anne Young from the Indianapolis Museum of Art in Newfields, thank you for joining us and participating in the study. We'd love to hear from you.
Thank you so much. It is great to be here today with all of you, and it's so exciting to see this report out and in the world. And it is my absolute honor to be able to represent Newfields in this today and its participation in the report. participating in this was really important because it continued our longstanding history of participating in previous reports around open access and licensing models and rights to reproductions work, and with reports and studies from Kelly and Capsalis and Wallace, and more than I can count probably at this point, and really looking at that evolution of rights and reproductions practices and where open accessing can really alleviate a lot of that work and allow copyright professionals, collections professionals to focus on other activities within their organizations. The timing of this report was also just incredible from our perspective, because it aligned exactly with our completing an IMLS grant project in which we completely redesigned our online collections portal and completely revamped top to bottom our open access program, including integration not only with our art collection, but where we could have with our archives collections online as well, and being able to bring all that together. So this was a really unique opportunity to kind of get some immediate feedback in the changes we'd made, how we were integrating the work in that project to completely kind of revamp and improve off of the previous iteration of open access that we had had that was nearing a decade in age. And so kind of how we could do that. I think kind of ongoing and moving forward in this work, it's looking at the fact that this work doesn't stop. There is always the data entry and data management. There is also the fact that, having staff available that annually making the updates in our collections management system for the new works that now have moved into the public domain annually, which means that then we could, in theory, be also increasing the number of works that we make available through our online open access program by getting those updates put in place annually. So having the staff time and focus to be able to do that work and to make those updates each year and every January when that actually occurs. The other side of it for us is really balancing copyright law with ethical considerations in rights management and looking at open access, and particularly with representations of materials from Indigenous communities, and really wanting to have deference to the Indigenous communities therein, to those materials, regardless of what the copyright status may be of any of those. And if they tell us that it should not be online, it should not be digitized, it should never have been digitized, perhaps to begin with, we'll remove those images, and kind of how we balance that and what that looks like moving forward. And I think then from there is just furthering our integration with the different tools at our disposal, whether that's rights statements, whether it's Creative Commons, whether it is working more with local contexts and notices and labels, and just kind of that idea that open access isn't just a one and done. You don't put it into place and step away. So it's, also making sure that leadership understands that, that even though, we finished the grant project, like there's still work to do to maintain and keep this moving forward. But thank you.
Great, thank you. Bridget, I'm going to let you open up. We have a little bit of time at the end for Q&A. We've got a couple in the chat, so go ahead.
Yeah, I can read out one from Chris Morrison. Hi, Chris. Chris is asking, I'd be interested to hear the author's comment on whether it's helpful to focus on the different interpretations of originality under copyright law, i.e., does the law give copyright protection for a faithful digital surrogate of a public domain work, or whether to try it and avoid this discussion in having the conversations about culture and openness. So I don't know who from our speakers would like to tackle this one, but it's basically, is it worth getting into the conversation of whether there's originality in a digital reproduction of a public domain work?
I'm happy
Bart, go
to
ahead.
take that. Yes, I think, there is value definitely. In terms of from a legal scholarship point of view, I think it's important to clarify that, in most jurisdictions, a faithful reproduction of a 2D artwork does not attract copyright, and our study did that briefly. I think we examined that scholarly debate and legal debate across the 4 jurisdictions, and I think we found that in all jurisdictions, it does not attract copyright. But at the same time, yes, I mean, it depends on, your aim really of your research or your work, but it's not necessarily the best starting point, to demonstrate the benefits of open, for example, or to examine those benefits. Because, from another point of view, even if you can't, in theory, claim copyright over those reproductions, some institutions still do, or they use other means like contract law to control. So I think the conversation probably needs to happen at another level, and in a way, that's what our project tried to do by looking at all of this, through the lens of business model, literature, and a case studies methodology. So we refer to that question of originality and copyright, but then we address it in a different way.
Thanks a lot. Lisa Bird wants to know, does anyone have any guidance or best practice of how to explain the benefits of open and licensing options to a donor who has inherited the copyright in the materials? So I'm imagining there's the heir of the artist who has inherited the copyright to the materials. How do we explain the benefits of openness to that person?
I mean, there's certainly guidance available explaining the benefits of open in general. In terms of the licenses that would be available or the assignment of rights that would happen at the point of deposit, there's certainly, I think the first one that springs to mind is probably Permission's a Survival Guide. This is specifically for works that are still in copyright, though, that are being donated. In terms of best practice, I don't know if there's kind of consensus on best practice for that, simply because there will be, I guess, a range of different circumstances and a range of different requirements might exist at the point of deposit. But there are examples of institutions that have engaged in digitization projects, for example, and when they've contacted the rights holder for permission, they've used the kind of the public interest mission of the project as a kind of as a way to advocate for the inheritor to assign a license or assign rights. I'm trying to think if there's any other. Again, practice will probably vary between library, archive, museum, and gallery institutions as well. I don't know if any of our respondents from cultural heritage institutions have examples that they might draw on for that question.
I think Chris has some insights to share in the meantime. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, just a sort of a sideline coming from the sort of the more of the business side. I mean, if for some reason the heir or the donor were worried that having an open version of the content available would preclude them from, let's say, exploiting their rights in some other commercial way to generate revenue themselves. I mean, there's no reason really preventing that. I mean, other than the sort of the free rider problem that, somebody would be able to access a high resolution digital copy of the work for free through the website of the museum. But there are so many other ways in which, the someone who owns a work or who is related to the work can potentially exploit it through, let's say, reissuing or providing some sort of new special edition or whatever it might be. So I think this poses a really interesting question, which is like, can an open version and a closed version exist side by side and be exploited in different ways? And I think yes, I think there's probably more work to be done to study that dynamic.
Thanks a lot. We're coming to the end of this webinar, so I will read out one last question, and then we'll unfortunately have to close this discussion. But I want to read from Joe Morphin. The question is, I was wondering if the report included any information about how open access helps Indigenous communities, for example, an archaeological object that belonged to an Indigenous community. Is this something that you tackle in this report?
We didn't go into that level of detail. I think the main respondents that we spoke to that had mentioned that they were considering those kind of community relationships. I think we're the Indianapolis Museum of Art at Newfields. I think the Welcome talked about it briefly as well. Bart, I don't know if any of Bart and Aline, I don't know if any other institutions from the case studies talked about it.
I think, yeah, some of the Brazilian institutions refer to shared management, but yeah, so it did emerge from the interviews, but in terms of any information about open access, how it helps, yeah, I'm not sure that it does that explicitly, but yeah, it emerges as one of the findings of the benefits of ethical management, what Molly was, sorry, what Anna was referring to earlier in a response. Yeah.
I think it's an area that requires further research.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, I think we have come really to the end of this webinar. I really want to thank the authors of the study who were with us today. So Aline, Victoria, Bart, and Chris, thank you so much for all your efforts in producing a phenomenal study. We've heard from many of the contributors how useful this will be to the community in really highlighting the economic dimensions of open access. So thank you so much for sharing the highlights today. Thank you also for your insights on the Cultural Heritage Institution perspective. So Jason, Molly, Christina, and Anne, thank you so much for joining this conversation, but also for all of the information that you were able to provide to really make this study richer and very concrete with your real life experiences. Thank you to Dee for masterminding this webinar. There's been a lot of quarreling on the back end, and thank you so much for getting everyone here and participating. Thank you to all the participants. Thank you for your questions, for your attention during today. If you are interested in these questions, this of course gave you a little taste of what's in the study, but I do encourage you to read the study. It's available on the Creative Commons website and on the Create website, on Zenodo. The links are all in the agenda. And of course, this is only the start of the conversation. I think it answered a lot of questions, but it also raised new ones. And we'd be happy to continue. So feel free to reach out. And if there's anything that you think would deserve a more thorough examination, we're really willing to look further into it. So that's it for me. And I hope to see you at our next Open Culture Live webinar or Open Culture platform meeting. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.